I sure am glad I got that Y70 touch build done with Hyte, and I'm not gonna have to upgrade my computer for another couple years. Whew. Oh, hi Hyte! Thank you! Yes, I'm partnered with Hyte again today to bring you two new computer builds in their Strawberry Milk Y70 and their Taro Milk Y70. Today we're going to be focusing on a beautiful pastel pink Y70 build in their new Strawberry Milk Y70. Now it's not going to be a complete build from scratch because a lot of the parts in my Y70 Touch are still perfectly fine. I only built it 8 months ago. So we're going to be moving a lot of components over from my old build to my new build, and we're going to be experimenting with something new today, custom water cooling. So let's get into the custom water cooling notes section of our video.
Flashing back to our last notes section.
Your central processing unit is the brain of your PC and is responsible for managing the instructions of computer programs that tell your PC which data to process, how to process input, store data, and output results. CPUs run at really high temps and are cooled by their own personal attached cooling system. But you're not limited to that stock cooler. I've seen a lot of people do some sick custom cooling, but that's a video for another day. Today is another day. Let's get into the custom water cooling notes section of the video. Let's start by talking about the top 3 ways people cool their processors. There's the more modern but trusty AIO or all-in-one cooler like the one I have in my current Y70 Touch. I would 100% recommend one of these if this is your first PC build. They're great for beginners. Then there's the more simplistic air cooling, which is, as it sounds, a metal block cooling your processor by 2 fans, and in just my opinion alone, I think this is so ugly. I'm sorry. And the final third option, the most glitz and glam option, the Optimus Prime option, the financially draining option, the emotionally grueling option, and the most high maintenance option, custom water cooling. And I am a high maintenance gal, so why not have a high maintenance computer, am I right? And one of the first things about a custom water cooling loop you need to know is what materials you're going to be using for the loop. There are 3 types of tubing in particular that I want to touch on. The first being the one that you're least likely to come by, which is glass. It's doable, but it has to be done by a professional. It is very dangerous to do if you try to do it yourself, but it looks very nice. Just the overall price and risk factor of glass alone makes it kind of not what people want to reach for when making a custom loop build. Secondly, there's plastic tubings, and we're going to talk about the difference between acrylic and PETG. Acrylic is lovely, but it's definitely more for the intermediate bender. It comes out with an amazing clear finish, but it has a higher risk of cracking during bending and is much harder to cut. Whereas PETG is more of a beginner-friendly and budget-friendly version of acrylic. It bends much easier than acrylic. It has less of a risk factor of cracking than acrylic, but it does have the slightest bit of a foggy hue to it when it is done. And that's what I'm going to be using today because I am pretty new to this, and the only experience I've had is with our last and third type of tubing, soft tubing or rubber tubing. One could argue that soft tubing is even more beginner friendly than any PETG bending could ever be, and that's true. It's very flexible, it's super affordable, it's easy to work with, but you are sacrificing the ability to make some really cool bends that PETG or acrylic could do. I'm just not willing to take that sacrifice, so I chose PETG as my tubing of choice, but ultimately it's up to whoever's building the PC. It's very circumstantial. Maybe soft tubing would look better in this PC, whereas hard tubing might look better in another. It's completely up to you. And the last thing that I would just want to add as a little tidbit is be mindful that your sizing of your tubing is compatible with your fittings and your cooling block and your reservoir. There is 12mm, 14mm, and 16mm. 14mm is the most standard, and that is what I'm going to be going with today. Along with that, your OD and ID measurements, inner diameter and outer diameter, especially when it comes to buying your fittings. Now that you know what material you want to do your custom water cooling loop with, we can get into the real deep of this, the research. I'm giving this little public service announcement now, although I should have given it earlier. I am not a professional by any means. I am just a girl harnessing the power of the internet, and sometimes the internet is not always right. So if you find anything that I say wrong in this note section, Please kindly let me know down below in the comments. Do not tear me to shreds. Like I said, I am just a girl. I'm not a scientist, I just play one on TV. So let's get into today's science lesson. Damn it, unfortunately, chemistry does have a use outside of high school. Sorry, gotta do this. Before looking into any fancy cool parts for a custom water loop, you need to think about something called galvanic corrosion. When it comes to custom cooling in a lot of parts such as fittings or the custom cooling block itself, there are two major metals to keep your eye out for: aluminum and copper. Both have their own pros and cons. Whereas aluminum can be more budget friendly, it is cheaper and it doesn't hold up over time as well as copper can, and copper is known to have more thermal benefits. By no means whatsoever should you combine them. Aluminum is a much more reactive metal, so it deteriorates faster over time, and when paired with copper, it'll rapidly accelerate the deterioration of the copper itself, which is a less reactive metal. That corrosion inevitably causes discoloration in your coolant and metal particles clogging your pump and radiator, but if you want to speed run destroying your computer, then by all means, go for it. I felt it was necessary to give you guys this science lesson prior to me getting into each and every individual component that makes a water cooling loop, so you can keep it in the back of your mind that you're going to be wanting to look for parts that are all of the same metal type. And when it comes to crossing brands, making sure that the brands are compatible with not only just your processor, but with each other too. And since I'm not sponsored for the portion of the video of water cooling, I do mix and match multiple brands, but making extra sure that all of the metals are compatible, I went with copper for my build. Primo Chill, Titan Rig, and Thermal Take. In case you guys want to sponsor me next time, y'all have my email. Now let's get into breaking down the major components of a custom water cooling rig. Let's start with your cooling block. Did you know you could cool both your CPU and your graphics card? It looks awesome, but I don't really feel like voiding the warranty on my brand spanking new graphics card today, so we're just cooling my CPU for now. There is a lot of really cool looking water blocks on the market, but your biggest priority will be to make sure that it's compatible with not only your processor, but with the rest of the metals you're using along in your loop. Making sure you're not getting an Intel water cooling block for an AMD build and vice versa, and also being mindful of your version of processor. One that's compatible with an AM4 might not be compatible with an AM5. This is why I always say do your own research and do it intensely. No amount of research is wasted, and in the description I linked a bunch of resources that I use to help me decide my build. There's Reddit, there's PC Part Picker, there's YouTube channels. There is always resources out there for you, you just need to go and find them. Next component, our radiator. A radiator helps you dissipate heat. Usually you screw fans into the bottom of it, and the size radiator you choose is completely dependent on the size case you have, and we all know these Hyte Y70s are big ass cases, so I'm gonna have a big ass radiator. My radiator is a 360mm, which is the span of 3 120 fans over the top of my Y70, but like I said, completely dependent on what case you're trying to fit this in. And my discretions with the radiator is, of course, make sure it's fitting to the size of your case, fitting to the size of your tubings and fittings, and doesn't cross-contaminate metals. It's the same metal as the rest of your loop. Your next driving component is actually two components combined, at least for my case, your pump and your reservoir. And a lot of modern reservoirs, like the one I'm going to be using today, come with a pre-installed pump into it, but if we were to buy them separately, a pump is just what pushes the coolant through the loop, and the reservoir stores extra coolant and also helps filter out air bubbles, and overall just looks really cool. Just stay mindful of the metals you're using and the tubing sizes. Lastly, and probably most tediously, we need to decide what kind of fittings we're going to want for a custom water loop. There are 3 types of fittings that are most commonly used. Let's talk about our first fitting, a barb.
Are you a Nicki fan?
What? Am I a Nicki fan? Pull up in the Sri Lanka. What?
I will not be using barbed fittings at all today because they are specifically for soft tubing builds. They are made for the rubber tubing. There's a barb at the end of the fitting that goes into the rubber tubing to give you a better hold and a better seal overall. It's not important for today's build unless you're deciding to make a soft tubing build. Moving on to the next one. Secondly, we have compression fittings, which work similarly to barbed fittings in the sense that they both have an insert piece that goes inside of the tube, but unlike barbed fittings that use a clamp around the tube to seal it in place, compression fittings have a secondary washer piece that slides over top the tubing, and when screwed in, it uses compression and internal O-rings to create an airtight seal. These are definitely the most common style of fittings as they're very reliable and you can get them in all sorts of shapes and angles angles and colors. They're very customizable and what I'm going to be using in this build. And lastly, I just want to briefly touch on push-in fittings. They do exactly as their name specifies. You just push the tubing into the fitting that has O-rings equipped inside, but there are no threads. It does not utilize compression the same way a compression fitting would, and it does not have barbs like a barbed fitting would. And for a more simple fitting style, you are risking a lot more with a less reliable air seal than the other two fittings, and with how expensive my components are, I'm not even gonna risk it. And by this point, I think you guys can say it with me. Be mindful of the metals you're mixing in your loop. All of my fittings are gonna be the same as the rest of the metals in my loop, with the odd exception of my brass drain port. Brass and copper are apparently friends and they can be paired together, but no aluminum. Don't mix metals that are not compatible. We're also being mindful of that 12, 14, 16 tubing measurement and also your ID and OD measurements. When I tell you that you have to make sure that each individual component is compatible with each other to make a successful water loop cooling build, you need to research. It's not me trying to be mean. Everybody's PC build is going to be different. I just don't want you wasting your money on parts that might not work together or risk messing up your build. Oh, and how could I forget the literal coolest part, the coolant? And my only advice for coolant really is just make sure you're getting it from a reputable store. I'm getting mine from Corsair, a very reputable brand. And read those reviews. Some coolants can get kind of nasty after a while. They can really stain your tubing. It's good to change out and flush your system every 6 months or so. Like I said, it's kind of high maintenance, but I'm a high maintenance girly and I'm down for it. In the final page of my notes section, I dedicate to all the tools and gadgets it takes to get a water cooling rig built up, tested, and running. But I'm not going to talk too much about them in the notes section. It's definitely gone on long enough. I'm just going to show you when I build the PC. And lastly, since I'm definitely more of a hands-on learner, I had Brandon 3D print me this baby Y70, and with some pipe cleaners I got at the Dollar Tree, some mismatched cardboard, a hot glue gun, and a dream, I made a little mock-up of the PC just to get a good understanding of the 3D realm of it. Brandon's definitely more of a mechanically minded person, so he actually did go in and make a 3D model of the PC, just so before we go into this we have more of an idea of how it's going to be. And if you guys can't tell already, this loop is definitely inspired by my mutual Celeste and also this Instagram account I found by the Real Bite Bender. They make some insane builds. Their accounts will be linked in the description below for sure. And to conclude our water cooling notes section, we learned the 3 ways people cool their processor, with air cooling, AIO cooling, and custom water loop cooling. We learned the 3 main types of tubing: glass, plastic, and rubber. We learned the difference between acrylic and PETG. We learned about galvanic corrosion and what causes it. We learned about a radiator, a pump, and a reservoir. And we learned about the differences between barbed, compression, and push-in fittings. And with all this new information, it's time to get into building the PC.
We're starting with gutting the old computer.
We're gonna remove our graphics card and put it back into its original box. I am actually handing this down to Brandon for the next build, so I knew the original box would come in handy. Next, we're removing our vertical mounting bracket and just getting it out of the way so we can access our motherboard and start unplugging all of the cables. I gradually loosened the CPU cooler and removed the thumb screws. In order for me to finish removing the CPU cooler, I have to put you guys on the world's longest montage of me removing every single NZXT RGB core fan out of my PC, including their little remote adapters that have to go with every single one. And NZXT, I love you dearly, but a little critique, I find those remote things so annoying. They mess with my cable management so bad. But now that all my fans are out, I'm finally able to fully remove the CPU cooler and put it back in its original box because I am handing it down to Brandon. And look at how many RGB fans were in my computer. I am such an RGB girly, I'm sorry. With some rubbing alcohol and a paper towel, I'm just cleaning up all the old thermal paste off of my processor. And for my comment section that accused me of running my computer dry, I'm not an idiot. A lot of modern AIO coolers come with thermal paste pre-applied in kind of a sheet form. While we're on the topic of processors and people in my comments, why do you guys hate the AM4 so much? It is an older processor chip, but it is still greatly supported. It's a good chip and it's super budget friendly, but I know you guys aren't gonna listen to me, so let's ask my good friend Linus. You guys thought I was gonna bring out Linus Tech Tips? Sorry, I lied. Gotta keep you on your toes. That man does not know me, but if LTT ever wants to collaborate for a build, hit me up. I'll figure something out.
Plouffe system does show how important it is to prioritize a bigger GPU and faster memory. I also think we could have gotten better bang for the buck if we didn't care about buying into a modern platform. Something like a 5800X3D with some higher-end DDR4 and a cheap AM4 motherboard makes for a wicked value gaming system and would give you even more money to spend on your GPU.
You guys heard the man. I did the best that I could with the budget that I have, and I feel like it's still a very budget-friendly and good build. And that's why I always say do your research when it comes to making a build, because you never know when you're gonna find something on sale. And back to our build, even with nothing in it, this case is absolutely stunning. I love the shade of pink. It's a nice mid-tone pastel pink, not too warm, not too cool, it's just right. And to begin our build, we have to uninstall yet another graphics card vertical mount, and I feel like I can install and uninstall these babies in my sleep at this point. I open the back and remove any packaging, and I'm gonna move forward just reinstalling my motherboard. I don't have to replace any RAM, processor, M.2, so I'm good to just put it back into the case. This is definitely one of the more easier parts of this build. I would even say the calm before the storm, because it got significantly harder and more tumultuous as we go. It was at this point I was realizing my heat sinks look a little too bland for this very pink and cute case. So I busted out the one and only acrylic paint. Yes, acrylic paint. Because I figured I could get a very close color match, which I did, and paint over my heat sinks with some acrylic paint, just in very thin layers, building up the opacity so I can get a very smooth finish. I started with alcoholing off the heat sinks, making sure there was no oil residue from my fingertips, and then I went in and very thoroughly color matched an almost identical shade of pink while it was wet. But like as acrylic does, it dried a completely different color than it looked when it was wet, so it is like a shade or two darker than the actual pink on the case, but I mean, I'd consider it a close enough shade of pink. Nobody's gonna be in my computer to tell the difference. I painstakingly went in and built up layer by layer pink on top of my heat sinks. One may ask if the layers of paint have any effect on the heat distributing properties of the motherboard, and not in my experience. I haven't noticed anything personally, and Linus Tech Tips let his kid hot glue AstroTurf to a heatsink and it was perfectly fine. A couple layers of paint ain't hurting nobody. And while I'm waiting on my coats of paint to dry, I'm gonna upgrade my storage from one 1TB M.2 and adding another M.2 with 2 more terabytes of space, so in total I have 3 terabytes, which is a very nice amount of storage, especially for these super long videos I've been making. And look at us getting closer to water cooling. We're gonna take our radiator and any product that touches the coolant, and we're gonna give them all a really good rinse with some distilled water and white vinegar. The ratio I used for making my cleaning solution is microwaving 3/4 of a glass cup worth of distilled water, and when it's done microwaving, adding the last 1/4 of distilled vinegar. For cleaning your radiator, it's important you use distilled water over tap water, because tap water can have trace levels of minerals and calcium contents that can get trapped up in your radiator and eventually into your reservoir, kind of be nasty and leave residue behind. And my apologies, as I was ill-prepared for this part and did not have a funnel on hand, so I ended up transferring my vinegar water solution to a glass measuring cup and had Brandon tilt the radiator as I poured water into both sides. I replaced the rubber caps that it originally came with and gave it a good shake. And I emptied it into a white mixing bowl so I could see the little metal shrapnel that comes out that's residual from the factory that you don't want floating through your loop. And that's why we're rinsing this. You do it a total of 4 times, the 4th being just hot distilled water without any vinegar. And this is the nastiness that came out of it. Once you guys get this close-up look, you can see exactly why you want to clean your radiator and flush your parts before building them into the loop, because all of that could have just been floating around freely. And after the radiator is thoroughly flushed, I put the rubber caps back on just so no dust can get trapped inside until we're ready to use it. And I'm taking my Alpha Cool cooling block and this plastic squeegee full of distilled water. I'm going to take it to my kitchen sink and give it a good rinse through as well. And now I'm super excited to unbox my thermal take pump / reservoir.
And nothing can go wrong. Oh no, it all went wrong.
This reservoir is widowy broken. So as you can imagine, that plastic tube rattling around on the inside is not supposed to do that. It's completely shattered and Amazon could not give me a replacement for an entire week. But there's one thing I learned as a theater kid, and it's that the show must go on, so let's continue as much as we can without it. I saved the 2 NZXT RGB strips from my last build. I'm keeping one for myself and passing down one to Brandon for the next build. I decided to move forward with installing some cheap pink fans onto my radiator. I made sure that they were pink to kind of blend in with the case and cover up the black radiator, but they were so cheap in fact that what the hell, they didn't have any front-facing screw ports for me to screw them in. So with some 3M mounting tape, I quite literally just mounted them to the radiator, and I mean, it worked. I'm just queen of jerry-rigging things, apparently. I wouldn't necessarily recommend these fans for this type of radiator mounting, but if you were to mount them into the case because they have the back screw ports, they'd be perfectly fine. And I quickly installed the radiator through the top of the case, pushing it as far forward as I possibly can because for Y70 cases, I like to budge in a second 120, but I really do need as much space as I can possibly get in order to do that because the case isn't necessarily meant to fit two 120 fans there. They're meant to fit 140, but I love fans. I love the way fans look, and more ventilation's never a bad thing. And remember that super long montage at the beginning of me removing every single NZXT RGB core fan out of my black case? Well, now this is just the inverse of that, of me reinstalling all of the NZXT RGB core fans into this pink case. And additionally, I had Brandon print some of our shop's best sellers, the hollow spiderweb heart fan covers, and this time I did in the shade pink to match the case. And you guys will never guess what the next step will be. That's right, to reinstall the graphics card vertical mounting bracket. Bro, I am so tired! So tired of doing these. But it makes way for a more fun step, such as installing this beautiful Galix GeForce RTX 4070 pink graphics card. And I'm aware they have the super version of it. It's at a bit of a higher price point and always seems to be in and out of stock. At the time I was looking for it, it wasn't in stock and they only had the black and white versions. So I just went with the 4070 pink version. And even when this graphics card is old and obsolete, I'm gonna put it up on a shelf because I love how it looks. But they're definitely more sought after because of their color wave, and I'm excited to have it as not only a part of my PC, but in the future a part of my collection. I made a cute little heart with some thermal paste, and I'm gonna install my cooling block, just making sure that the bracket is an AMD bracket to be compatible with my motherboard, but if you have Intel, make sure it's compatible with your Intel motherboard. And similar to our last AIO cooler, you're gonna have these thumb screws that you want to screw down at all similar tensions to ensure that your thermal compound is spreading evenly underneath it. And while we're here, I'm going to screw these starter fittings into the cooling block. Using the broken pump as a base for measurement, I threw together a Photoshop file of exactly how I wanted the decal on the side of the reservoir to look. I wanted it to give very medical vibes, very syringe, so my lovely friend Brooke came over with her Cricut and helped me cut out some vinyl decals for this craft. And honestly, Brooke, I know you're watching this, I couldn't have done this without you. Thank you so much. You have literally been such a lifesaver for this craft. And I think to really sell the syringy look, I wanted to create some kind of base that looked like a needle going into the bottom of the PC, and it would also raise up the reservoir so visually you could see it a little bit better inside the case. So using Brandon's 3D print model of the PC that we used to kind of get an idea of how the tubing should be, Brandon made a base for the syringe and this really cute little hat with some angel wings to go on top, just to give it that kind of handle look that an actual syringe would have. I often see in a J-fashion style called Yami Kawaii these syringes with angel wings, and I really love how that looks, so I emulated that there, and me and Brandon made a very rushed and ugly print prototype on the broken pump so we could move forward with bending our PETG pipes around it as if it were just installed and it was a working pump. And whilst editing this footage and looking back at the prototype versions and sketch versions of this syringe reservoir, I am so happy with the final result is, but I'm getting ahead of myself. You guys will see that at the end. Let's start the hard part, bending our PETG. For starters, I got a cheap heat gun on Amazon. It does not get too crazy hot, so it's on one of its highest settings, which is a good setting for bending PETG. Inside there is a silicone insert in the tube so the tube doesn't cave in on itself when you go to bend it, and I'm using work gloves just because the tubing can get very hot when you're bending. Then there's these tools that can help you get right angles, but honestly at the end of it, and a lot of YouTubers have said this as well, I ended up just freehanding a lot of the curves. At points it felt like the tools made to help you get really sharp and clean angles were actually just getting in the way, and I could get sharper and cleaner angles if I did it by freehand. And I know you guys are dying to know, Zoe, when do you know that the PETG is ready to bend? And trust me, you will know, because if it has any stiffness or rigidity and it's fighting you back not to bend, it's not ready. But the second it feels like a gelatinous goop and it's trying to fall out of your hands, that's how you know it's ready to bend. Something to note is PETG does have memory, so it's important to hold it into position while it's cooling down and let it fully cool in between between separate bends because it might try to return to that straight position that it was manufactured as. And when cutting your PETG to size, it's important to sand down and flatten the ends with this pencil sharpener type tool that has two sides where you can really clean up and make flat the ending of your cut. If you were to leave your cuts jagged and uneven, it can cause leaking inside of your fittings, and nobody wants that. Speaking of fittings, these are the fittings that me and Brandon choose, just some plain black compression fittings of all different shapes and angles, and I got a bunch extra in case in the future I want to make a different custom loop, change it up a little bit, or if anything were to happen. This footage is a really good example on how compression fittings slide over top the tube with the O-ring to give a relatively airtight seal. Nice! Oh, and bending that PETG into a heart was so easy, it only took me like 6 tries in 2 days, but today's the day. The new pump is here. Before we install this new reservoir, I'm gonna syringify it. Brandon printed me this nice, clean, refined version of the needle top cap and the needle base bottom. I'm gonna use some white acrylic paint to paint the wings and these Gundam chrome paint markers to paint the needle point and the surrounding border of the syringe top hat. Where have these chrome markers been my whole life? These are so cool. To provide extra security to the top and the bottom of the needle top base, I am adding a 3M tape pad, and along with that, zip tying the bottom to the bottom of the case where it's kind of hard to screw in, and screwing the reservoir into the top of the needle point base as well. Now that I know my reservoir is secure as possible, we can slap on these decals, and it is looking so cool and so syringy. Also, I don't know why every single time I try to build a PC, the world tries to nerf me, take me out, not let these PCs see the light of day, but unfortunately I did not get as much footage as I would have liked of Brandon installing my PETG and my compression fittings because I got viscerally ill and started throwing up everywhere, so Brandon took over for a night and installed all my tubings and fittings, but this PC is now ready to be pressure tested. So with a Corsair pressure tester, we're gonna move on to air testing this PC to see if there's any leaks, and just a good example of this is you would connect it to a fitting, push some pressure through it, leave the pressure in there for a little bit, and if the number hasn't changed, that means there is no leaks for the air to leave. A second way of testing our loop though is using this plastic jumper that connects to your 24 pin to jump start your loop, where you can run some fluid through your loop without it actually powering to your motherboard. And that's exactly what we did for a secondary test, just to be sure, is Brandon ran some distilled water through the loop system. You do not have to risk frying your motherboard just to leak test your loop, and after a couple hours of leak testing, luckily for us, our loop was absolutely airtight, beautiful, ready to go. Additionally, I want to talk about the importance of making sure you have a drain port somewhere towards the bottom of your loop. We put our drain port at the very bottom of our reservoir so we can run this distilled water through it, make sure there's no gunkies inside of the reservoir, the radiator, any of our parts, and then at the very end we can just drain it out the bottom. And as you can see, as this is draining, there is some kind of filmy stuff inside the water that definitely would have gunked up our loop if I hadn't previously gave everything a good rinse. With our loop double tested and now rinsed and drained, we're ready for coolant. I'm going in with this Corsair Super Chill Candy Apple Red coolant. I wanted something that would emulate blood, but not in a super realistic way. I wanted it very cartoony because I feel like it would complement the pink case super well. I'm filling the reservoir to the top with coolant, then hitting the jumper so it can suck down some of the coolant into the tubings, stopping the jump before the reservoir gets completely empty so you never run the risk of running it dry. I did this about 3 times, filling the reservoir until the loop was completely filled, and it's just gorgeous. In my initial sketch, I drew some blood droplet kind of decals coming from the top of the glass, and lucky for me, just by chance I went to the Dollar Tree around Halloween time and they had these window clinks that would work perfectly and are a great temporary answer in case I ever wanted to take them back off the glass. It would not damage the glass whatsoever. I love the pastel pink and the blood drops. It reminds me a lot of a Gloomy Bear. They recently put out a Gloomy Bear PC, I think Starforge might have. It looks super cool. This is kind of like my take on that. My only complaint with these blood clings is they do have some air bubbling underneath it, but just don't look that close. How about that? Glass panels are reinstalled, cable management done, back panel reinstalled, top panel reinstalled. It is time for the final peel and reveal. Oh my goodness, it's gorgeous. It's more gorgeous than I thought it was gonna be. I absolutely love this.
Hey guys, it's Zoe from the future. A couple days later, I got violently ill towards the end of the PC build, so I apologize if any of the footage is just kind of rushed or chaotic. I was very, very ill, and so was Brandon, but we made it through, and I can easily say this was the most tumultuous and chaotic computer build I'm probably ever gonna have in my entire life. But was it worth it? Oh, every ounce of it was worth it, because oh my goodness, this looks so close to the concept art that I drew. I absolutely love how this turned out, and I just want to thank Hyte once again. Like, thank you so much for sponsoring me through these collabs, getting me through with these cases. I got the Strawberry Milk Y70. Stay tuned for the next build where I upgrade Brandon's PC to the Taro Milk Y70 in that lovely shade of purple. It's actually literally right here off camera waiting for me. I'm not sponsored by Nvidia, by the way. I just found this shirt on eBay and I thought it looked cool. But branching off of that, all of these components in these builds are out of me and Brandon's pockets, and I view it as an expense towards my channel, investing in my channel, but it is very expensive nonetheless. If you guys want to support our channel on future projects, of course, like, subscribe, do that. But we are opening up a Patreon channel where we're gonna have the behind the scenes of our projects, my sketching, Brandon's 3D printing, a lot of behind the scenes content, but also we're thinking of doing some kind of tiering where we do a cooking video a week. Me and Brandon, we try out a new recipe or show a recipe we really like, cook it, eat it together. It's a nice bonding experience for me and Brandon, and it helps me connect with my community. You guys can share recipes with me, and me and Brandon can try them in a video once a week. And I just need to make a disclaimer, do not take that out of context. This is not me saying my followers are responsible for funding me and Brandon's YouTube videos. Absolutely not. There are so many more bigger and trivial things in life to me and Brandon doing a behind the scenes video or a cooking video that YouTube doesn't get. I am not trying to pressure you guys into this by any means. You guys will not be missing out on too much. I just want to make it an option available to people who are in the financial space and would like to invest in something like that. So feel no pressure either way. But like I said, the information will be in the description, as I do not have all the information right now. I'm still in the drafting period of it, but it should be done by the time this video goes up. And at the end of the day, I would not be able to live my dream and have a YouTube channel and do these super awesome videos if it weren't for you guys. So at the end of the day, thank you guys more than anything. So I love you guys. Bye. Oh, it's Hyte. Hi, Hyte.